Hello everyone, welcome to our channel. Before you dive into this historical footprints, we invite you to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Discover the pivotal moments that shaped modern America, the fight for civil rights, the anti-war movement, second-wave feminism, and the unfinished revolution, a civil rights odyssey. Imagine a world divided by a line you cannot cross, a world where the color of your skin is a cage. This was the reality of the United States as it entered the 1960s, a nation at war with its own promises. The decade began not with a bang, but with a quiet seat at a lunch counter in Greensboro, where four young men decided that the price of their dignity was worth the risk of their lives. That simple act of sitting down stood up for a whole generation, igniting a fire that would sweep through the South like a summer storm. From the dusty roads of Mississippi to the marble halls of Washington, the air was thick with the scent of change and the stench of tear gas. The movement was a symphony of voices led by the resonant, rolling thunder of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who believed that the moral arc of the universe eventually bends toward justice. But that bend required the weight of thousands of bodies on the line. The Freedom Riders boarded buses knowing they might never get off, crossing into territories where the law was a stranger and hate was a neighbor. They faced the firebombs in Anniston and the iron pipes in Birmingham, their blood staining the pavement of the very country they sought to redeem. Yet for every bus burned, a new spirit was forged, proving that you can kill a dreamer, but you cannot kill the dream. In the sweltering heat of 1963, the nation held its breath as 250,000 people descended upon the Lincoln Memorial. It was a sea of humanity, a mosaic of black and white faces yearning for a beloved community. When Dr. King spoke of his dream, it wasn't just a speech, it was a prophecy that echoed off the monuments of men who had promised liberty but delivered chains. But the euphoria of the march was met with the cold reality of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, where 4 little girls became martyrs before they could become women. This was the brutal rhythm of the 60s, 1 step toward the light, 2 steps through the fire. The struggle shifted from lunch counters to ballot boxes as the movement realized that a seat at the table meant nothing without the power to vote. The road from Selma to Montgomery became a trail of tears and triumph, marked by the broken bones of Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The images of state troopers beating peaceful marchers flickered on television screens across the globe, forcing America to look into a mirror and recoil at what it saw. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a son of the South, was moved to declare, "We shall overcome," signing laws that finally dismantled the legal architecture of white supremacy. But as the laws changed, the soul of the movement began to vibrate with new frequencies. In the urban centers of the North and West, the cry for Black Power rose like a phoenix. Malcolm X challenged the nation with a different truth, speaking of self-defense and the reclamation of identity by any means necessary. The movement grew teeth and claws, focusing on the hidden shackles of poverty, redlining, and police brutality that no piece of legislation could easily erase. It was a time of radical transformation where the afro became a crown and black is beautiful became a revolutionary decree. The decade took its most painful turn in Memphis on a balcony in 1968 when a single bullet silenced the voice of the king. The smoke from 100 burning cities signaled the end of an era, but not the end of the march. The footprints left in the 1960s were deep and permanent, carving a path through the wilderness of prejudice that we are still walking today. These were the years that redefined what it meant to be an American, proving that democracy is not a gift, but a constant, grueling labor of love and resistance. As we look back at these giants of history, we realize that their footprints are not just relics of the past, but maps for our future. The Great Refusal, the anti-war movement of the 1960s. The 1960s began with a call to service, but for a generation of young Americans, it ended in a crisis of conscience. As the jungle warfare of Vietnam escalated, a different kind of war was being fought on the streets of Chicago, Berkeley, and Washington, D.C. It started in the ivy-covered halls of universities, where students began to question why they were being sent 10,000 miles away to fight for a cause they didn't understand. The draft became a shadow hanging over every young man's future, a lottery where the prize was a rifle and a one-way ticket to Saigon. What began as a ripple of protest soon turned into a tidal wave of dissent that threatened to tear the fabric of American society apart. This was the era of the credibility gap, a time when the words of the government and the images on the nightly news simply didn't match. For the first time in history, the horrors of war were broadcast directly into American living rooms, bringing the smell of napalm and the sight of body bags to the dinner table. The movement was a kaleidoscope of faces, shaggy-haired hippies with flowers in their hair, grizzled veterans throwing their medals over the White House fence, and mothers who refused to sacrifice their sons to a lost cause. "Make love, not war" wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a desperate plea for a new way of living in a world that seemed obsessed with destruction. By 1967, the resistance had reached a fever pitch. In the Summer of Love, thousands gathered not just for music, but to build a counterculture that rejected the military-industrial complex. Burning draft cards became a ritual of defiance, an act of civil disobedience that carried the weight of prison time. The Pentagon, the very heart of American military power, found itself surrounded by protesters attempting to levitate the building through the power of collective meditation. It was a surreal, chaotic, and deeply earnest attempt to stop the machinery of death. But the government's response was often swift and brutal, leading to a polarization that pitted neighbor against neighbor and father against son. The year 1968 served as the breaking point. The Tet Offensive proved that the war was far from over, and the chaos of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago showed a nation in a state of nervous breakdown. Police clashed with protesters in the streets as the world watched, capturing a country at war with its own youth. The movement was no longer just about Vietnam. It was about the right to speak, the right to dissent, and the definition of patriotism itself. To the protesters, loving their country meant stopping it from making a terrible mistake. To their critics, they were nothing short of traitors. Tragedy struck at its peak in 1970 at Kent State University, where the National Guard opened fire on unarmed students. 4 lay dead in the grass, an image that froze the heart of the nation. The silent majority could no longer remain silent, as the cost of the war was now being paid in American blood on American soil. This movement forced a sitting president to choose not to run for re-election, and eventually compelled the most powerful military on earth to withdraw. The footprints of the anti-war movement remind us that in a democracy, the ultimate power doesn't lie in the hands of the generals, but in the voices of the people who refuse to be silent. The Awakening, the second wave of feminism. As the 1960s roared on, a quiet revolution was simmering behind the manicured lawns of suburban America. For decades, the American dream had been defined for women by the walls of their kitchens and the needs of their families. But a growing restlessness was beginning to break through the silence. This was the birth of second-wave feminism, a movement that looked beyond the right to vote and took aim at the very structure of society. It began with the realization that the personal is political, that the struggles women faced in their private lives, from the workplace to the home, were part of a much larger system of inequality. When Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, she gave a name to the problem that has no name, giving voice to millions of women who felt trapped by societal expectations. Suddenly, the conversation shifted from the domestic to the professional. Women began to demand not just jobs, but careers, not just a paycheck, but equal pay for equal work. They gathered in consciousness-raising groups, sharing stories of discrimination that had long been kept in the shadows. They fought for reproductive freedom, for the right to own credit cards in their own names, and for a seat at the tables where history was being written. The movement was a tapestry of diverse voices, from the intellectual rigor of Gloria Steinem to the grassroots activism of the National Organization for Women. It wasn't just about changing laws, it was about changing minds. They protested Miss America pageants to challenge the objectification of the female body and marched down Fifth Avenue to demand total liberation. By the end of the decade, the image of the ideal woman had been shattered, replaced by a new reality of independence and strength. The footprints of these women paved the way for a world where a woman's potential is limited only by her dreams, not her gender. The Green Revolution, the birth of environmentalism. While the streets were filled with protesters fighting for social justice, another movement was quietly taking root, one that looked toward the very earth beneath their feet. For over a century, the industrial machine of America had been fueled by a disregard for the natural world, leaving rivers of fire and skies of soot in its wake. But in 1962, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring acted as a clarion call, warning of a future where the birds no longer sang because of the chemicals we poured into the soil. It was the moment the American conscience woke up to the fragility of our planet. The 1960s saw the emergence of a new kind of awareness. People began to realize that the progress of the nation could not come at the cost of its survival. When the Cuyahoga River in Ohio literally caught fire due to industrial pollution, the image became a symbol of a system gone wrong. The movement culminated in the first Earth Day in 1970, where 20 million Americans, 10% of the population at the time, took to the streets, parks, and auditoriums to demonstrate for a healthy, sustainable environment. It was a rare moment of unity, bringing together Republicans and Democrats, rich and poor, city dwellers and farmers. This groundswell of public pressure led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the passing of the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. It shifted the narrative from conquering nature to protecting it. The environmental movement of the 60s taught us that we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. These footprints remind us that our greatest legacy is the air we breathe and the water we drink. As we look back, we see that the 1960s wasn't just a decade of social change.